The Last Stand at Edson's Ridge. You ever wonder what goes through a man's mind when he knows the odds are stacked impossibly against him? When every rational calculation says he shouldn't survive the night? September 1942, a thin strip of land in the South Pacific called Guadalcanal, and 840 United States Marines are about to find out exactly what they're made of when 2,500 Japanese soldiers come screaming out of the jungle with one goal: complete annihilation. This is the story of Edson's Ridge, and I'm telling you right now, what happened on that blood-soaked hillside defies everything you think you know about warfare, courage, and the limits of human endurance. Let me set the scene for you. It's early September 1942, and the Pacific War is not going well for the United States. Pearl Harbor was less than a year ago, and the Japanese military machine has been rolling through the Pacific like an unstoppable force. They've taken the Philippines, they've taken Singapore, they've taken Wake Island. Everywhere the rising sun flag goes up, another piece of Allied territory falls. The Japanese seem invincible, and American morale back home is starting to crack. Then someone in the War Department gets a brilliant idea. Guadalcanal. This little speck of jungle and coral in the Solomon Islands has something the Japanese want badly: an airfield they're building called Henderson Field. If the Japanese complete that airfield, they'll control the skies over the entire region. American supply lines to Australia get cut, and the whole Pacific strategy collapses like a house of cards. So in August 1942, the Marines land on Guadalcanal in what's basically the first major American offensive of the war. They catch the Japanese by surprise, capture the unfinished airfield, and for a brief moment, everyone thinks maybe this won't be so hard.
They're wrong. Dead wrong.
The Japanese commanders are absolutely furious. Losing Guadalcanal would be a humiliating defeat, and humiliation is not something they can accept. They start pouring troops onto the island, and suddenly the Marines who thought they'd won a quick victory realize they're stuck on a disease-ridden jungle island with an enemy that will fight to the last man to take it back. And that's where our story really begins. Enter Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, but everyone just calls him Red Mike. Now, Red Mike Edson is not your typical Marine officer. This guy is a legend even before Guadalcanal. He's a World War I veteran, an expert in small unit tactics, and he has this reputation for being absolutely fearless, borderline crazy in combat. He's lean, intense, with these piercing eyes that seem to look right through you. When Edson tells you to do something, you do it, because you know this man has forgotten more about fighting than most people will ever learn. Edson commands the 1st Raider Battalion, an elite unit of Marines specially trained for amphibious raids and jungle warfare. These aren't conscripts or fresh recruits. These are hardened warriors who volunteered for one of the toughest assignments in the Corps. They've already seen action in other raids, but nothing, absolutely nothing, has prepared them for what's coming. By early September, American intelligence starts picking up signs that the Japanese are planning something big. Radio intercepts, reconnaissance reports, captured documents, they all point to a major offensive aimed at recapturing Henderson Field. The Japanese have been landing reinforcements at night, using fast destroyers in what the Marines sarcastically call the Tokyo Express. Every night, more enemy soldiers slip onto the island under cover of darkness. The Marines know they're coming. They just don't know exactly when or where the hammer will fall. Edson, with his tactical genius, studies the terrain around Henderson Field. There's this ridge, a low coral and grass-covered elevation that runs roughly north to south, just south of the airfield. It's not particularly impressive to look at, maybe 100 feet high at its peak, covered in kunai grass that cuts your hands if you're not careful. But Edson sees what others miss. This ridge is the key to everything. If the Japanese take this ridge, they have a clear path to Henderson Field. If they take Henderson Field, they control Guadalcanal. If they control Guadalcanal, the whole Pacific strategy unravels. Everything depends on holding this one piece of high ground. On September 11th, Edson moves his raiders, along with the 1st Parachute Battalion, onto the ridge. Altogether, he's got about 840 men. They start digging in, establishing defensive positions, setting up machine gun nests, plotting fields of fire. The work is brutal. The ground is hard coral in places, soft mud in others. The heat is oppressive, the kind of wet, suffocating heat that makes every movement feel like you're wading through water. Mosquitoes swarm in clouds, and the men are already dealing with malaria, dysentery, and jungle rot. But they dig. They dig because Red Mike tells them their lives depend on it, and they believe him. September 12th arrives, and that night, the Japanese make their first probe. It's not the main attack, just a reconnaissance in force, but it's terrifying. Out of the darkness comes this sound that will haunt the Marines for the rest of their lives. Japanese soldiers screaming, yelling, creating this cacophony of noise designed to terrify and confuse. They're probing the defenses, looking for weak points, and they hit the Marine lines like a wave. The fighting is close, brutal, desperate. Marines fire into the darkness at muzzle flashes and shadows. Grenades explode, tracers light up the night, and the smell of gunpowder and blood fills the air. The Marines hold, but just barely. When dawn breaks, they count their casualties and look at each other with a new understanding. That was just the appetizer. The main course is coming. All day on September 13th, the Marines prepare. They improve their positions, redistribute ammunition, tend to their wounded. The jungle around them is ominously quiet. No bird calls, no animal sounds, just this oppressive silence that every combat veteran knows means trouble. The Japanese are out there, gathering in the jungle, preparing for the big push. American artillery crews register their guns on likely approach routes. Machine gunners test their weapons and stack ammunition. Everyone knows what's coming, but knowing doesn't make it any easier. As the sun sets on September 13th, the temperature drops slightly, but the tension rises. The Marines on Edson's Ridge check their weapons one more time, make sure their grenades are within easy reach, and wait. Some pray, some write letters they hope they'll never have to send. Some just sit in silence, alone with their thoughts. Red Mike Edson moves among them, calm and confident, his presence a steadying force. If their commander isn't worried, maybe they'll be okay. But Edson is worried. He's just too much of a professional to show it.
Then, around 9 p.m., all hell breaks loose.
The Japanese bombardment begins with naval gunfire. Destroyers offshore open up, and shells start slamming into the ridge. The earth erupts in geysers of dirt and coral. Trees explode into splinters. The noise is indescribable, a physical force that hammers at your eardrums and makes your brain rattle in your skull. The Marines hunker down in their foxholes, trying to make themselves as small as possible, praying that the next shell doesn't have their name on it. This goes on for what feels like hours, but is probably only 20 or 30 minutes. Then the naval guns stop, and for a moment, there's this eerie silence. That's when the ground attack begins. Out of the jungle they come, wave after wave of Japanese soldiers, and there are so many of them. The Marines on the ridge can see them in the darkness, masses of men moving forward with fixed bayonets, screaming, firing from the hip. The Japanese tactics are straightforward and terrifying. Overwhelm the defenders with sheer numbers and fanatical courage. They don't care about casualties. They've been told that dying for the emperor is the highest honor, and they believe it with every fiber of their being. The Marines open fire, and the ridge erupts in a storm of lead. Machine guns chatter, rifles crack. The single 37mm gun Edson has positioned fires canister shot like a giant shotgun, cutting down Japanese soldiers in swaths. Artillery from behind the ridge starts dropping shells just meters in front of the Marine positions. Danger close fire that kills attacking Japanese, and sometimes Marines too. But it's a price that has to be paid. The smell of cordite, blood, and death becomes overwhelming. But the Japanese keep coming. They're not like any enemy the Americans have faced before. When you shoot one, another takes his place. When you mow down a whole squad with machine gun fire, another squad charges forward over the bodies. They're closing the distance, getting into grenade range, and then it becomes a different kind of fight. Grenades arc through the darkness, exploding with sharp cracks. Japanese soldiers make it to the Marine positions, and suddenly it's hand-to-hand combat, bayonets and rifle butts and knives. This is fighting at its most primitive and brutal. The Marine line begins to buckle. In some places, Japanese soldiers break through, and suddenly they're in the defensive positions, fighting in the foxholes and trenches. This is every defender's nightmare, the enemy inside your lines, and it's happening all along the ridge. Marines are fighting individual battles in the darkness, unable to see more than a few feet, unsure if that shape in the darkness is friend or enemy. The confusion is total, the fear is paralyzing, and men are dying on both sides in droves. Red Mike Edson is everywhere. He moves along the line under fire, organizing desperate counterattacks, plugging holes in the defense, pulling men from relatively quiet sectors to reinforce collapsing positions. He's been grazed by bullets twice already, but he doesn't seem to notice or care. His uniform is torn and bloody, his face is blackened with powder smoke, but his voice is calm and steady. He's living up to his reputation, and the Marines draw strength from his example. If Red Mike says they can hold, then by God they'll hold. But holding is getting harder by the minute. The Japanese are pushing forward with suicidal determination. They're taking horrific casualties, bodies stacking up in front of the Marine positions, but their numbers seem endless. For every Japanese soldier killed, 2 more appear. The Marines are running low on ammunition. Machine gunners are firing in short bursts, trying to conserve ammo. But that means more Japanese soldiers are getting closer. Some Marines are down to their last clips. Others are scavenging ammunition from the dead and wounded. Around midnight, the situation becomes critical. The Japanese have pushed the Marines back from the forward positions. What started as a defense along the entire ridge has collapsed into a desperate last stand on the highest point. Edson's 840 Marines are now compressed into a space not much bigger than a football field, surrounded on 3 sides by 2,500 screaming, attacking Japanese soldiers. The mathematics are brutal and simple. If the Japanese break through here, it's over. Henderson Field falls, Guadalcanal falls, and the first American offensive of the Pacific War ends in catastrophic defeat. Edson makes a decision. He calls in artillery fire on his own position. You heard that right. He tells the artillery batteries to fire on the ridge itself, on coordinates where his own men are fighting. It's an insane decision, a last desperate gamble, but it's also the only thing that might save them. The artillery commanders think he's lost his mind. They double-check the coordinates, make sure they heard correctly, but Edson is adamant. Fire on the ridge. Fire now. The American shells start falling, and they're landing so close that Marines can feel the heat from the explosions, can feel shrapnel whistling overhead. Some of the shells fall short, killing Marines along with Japanese, but the bombardment does what Edson hoped it would. It breaks up the Japanese attack. The massed waves of soldiers scatter, seeking cover from the rain of steel. It buys the Marines precious minutes to regroup, to redistribute ammunition, to brace for the next assault. And the next assault comes, and the one after that. All through the night, the Japanese attack again and again. They come in waves, in small groups, individually. They never stop, never give up. Each attack is beaten back by Marines who are beyond exhaustion, running on adrenaline and sheer willpower. Some Marines are so tired they're falling asleep between attacks, then snapping awake when the next wave hits. They're firing their weapons mechanically, loading and firing, not thinking anymore, just reacting. The darkness is the worst part. Nobody can see more than a few feet. Muzzle flashes create temporary islands of light that destroy your night vision. The Marines fire at sounds, at shadows, at anything that moves. Sometimes they're shooting at Japanese soldiers. Sometimes they're shooting at their own imagination. The stress is unbearable. Several Marines crack, start screaming or crying or just curl up in their foxholes. Their buddies slap them, shake them, do whatever it takes to bring them back because they need every rifle on the line. Dawn on September 14th arrives like a blessing from heaven. As the sun comes up, the Japanese attacks finally, mercifully, stop. The Marines on the ridge can't believe they've survived. They look around at what's left of their positions, and it looks like a vision of hell. Bodies everywhere. American and Japanese mixed together. Shell craters, shattered trees, abandoned equipment, blood soaking into the coral soil. The stench is overwhelming. Some Marines vomit. Others just stare, trying to process what they've been through. Edson counts his men. Out of 840 Marines who defended the ridge, he's lost about 135 killed or wounded. That's roughly 16% casualties, which in military terms is heavy but sustainable. He looks down the forward slope of the ridge, and what he sees is almost beyond comprehension. Hundreds of Japanese bodies carpet the hillside. In some places, they're stacked 3 or 4 deep. The exact count will never be known, but estimates range from 600 to over 1,000 Japanese soldiers killed in the night attacks. The Japanese have been shattered, their offensive broken against the immovable will of 840 Marines who refused to die. But the Marines on the ridge don't have time to celebrate because they don't know if the Japanese will attack again. They spend the day improving positions, bringing up ammunition and supplies, evacuating wounded. They're waiting for night to fall, dreading what it might bring. But the next night is quiet, and the night after that. The Japanese have learned a hard lesson. You cannot break the Marines through sheer willpower alone. Edson's Ridge, which will forever after be called exactly that, Edson's Ridge, held firm when everything said it should have collapsed. The defense of Edson's Ridge became one of the defining moments of the Guadalcanal campaign. Henderson Field stayed in American hands. The Marines kept their foothold on the island. The Japanese never mounted another major offensive with the same intensity. The Tokyo Express would keep running. Japanese and American forces would keep fighting over that miserable jungle island for months. But the Japanese attack had been broken on that coral ridge in September 1942. Red Mike Edson received the Medal of Honor for his leadership during the battle. His citation specifically mentions how he successfully resisted fierce hostile assaults and, personally commanding the final defense line, repulsed the enemy attack. But anyone who was there will tell you that the medal should have been collective, pinned on every Marine who held that ridge when all logic said they should run. The battle had ripple effects far beyond Guadalcanal. Back in the United States, news of the victory provided a desperately needed morale boost. Americans were hungry for proof that their boys could stand toe-to-toe with the Japanese and win. Edson's Ridge gave them that proof. In Japan, military planners had to recalculate their assumptions. The Americans weren't going to fold easily. This was going to be a long, bloody war. For the Marines who survived, Edson's Ridge became a defining experience. Many of them would fight through the rest of the Pacific War, from Tarawa to Iwo Jima to Okinawa. They'd face banzai charges and cave fighting and kamikazes, but they'd always remember that night on Guadalcanal when they looked into the abyss and didn't blink. It changed them. How could it not? When you've held off 2,500 enemy soldiers with 840 men, when you've called artillery down on your own position and survived, when you fought hand-to-hand in the darkness and lived to see the sunrise, you become something different, something harder. The tactical lessons from Edson's Ridge were studied extensively. The effectiveness of concentrated artillery fire, the importance of terrain, the value of aggressive leadership, the need for units that can maintain cohesion under extreme stress. All of these became part of Marine Corps doctrine. Young officers at Quantico would study the battle for decades afterward, walking through the details, trying to understand how Edson made his decisions, how the Marines maintained their defensive integrity when the line was breaking. But beyond the tactics and the strategy, Edson's Ridge represents something more fundamental about warfare and human nature. It's about what happens when men are pushed to their absolute limits and choose to stand firm anyway. It's easy to be brave when the odds are in your favor. It's easy to fight when you've got superior numbers and firepower. But what do you do when you're outnumbered 3-1, when the enemy is in your positions, when you're out of ammunition and your friends are dying around you. That's when you find out what you're really made of. The Marines on Edson's Ridge found out they were made of something extraordinary. They found reserves of courage and endurance they didn't know they possessed. They learned that the man next to you matters more than your own fear, that leadership can hold a unit together when everything's falling apart, that sometimes the only difference between victory and defeat is the refusal to accept defeat. Red Mike Edson would survive the war and eventually retire as a major general, but he'd always be known for that night on Guadalcanal. In later years, when people asked him about the battle, he'd deflect credit to his Marines. He'd say he just did what needed to be done, that any Marine officer would have done the same. But the men who served under him knew better. They knew that Edson's leadership, his tactical brilliance, his personal courage under fire, made the difference between holding the ridge and losing it. The ridge itself still exists, of course. If you go to Guadalcanal today, you can visit the site. It's peaceful now, covered in vegetation, with monuments marking where the Americans held their line. Tour guides will walk you through the battle, pointing out key positions, explaining the flow of the fight. But standing there in the sunshine, it's hard to imagine the chaos and terror of that September night. The screaming, the explosions, the smell of death, the taste of fear. You can't capture that in a monument or a museum display. In the decades since World War II, military historians have debated various aspects of the battle. Some argue that the Japanese tactics were poorly suited to the terrain and situation. Others suggest that better coordination might have broken the Marine line. There are discussions about whether the Japanese should have concentrated their forces or dispersed them, whether they should have used more artillery preparation, whether their human wave tactics were bravery or waste. These academic discussions miss the essential point. In the moment, with imperfect information and no time to reconsider, both sides fought with everything they had. The Marines just fought a little better. The story of Edson's Ridge is ultimately a story about the cost of freedom. Those 840 Marines didn't volunteer to defend that ridge because they loved dying. They did it because it needed to be done, because if they didn't hold that line, the consequences would cascade outward, affecting the entire war effort. They understood, in a visceral way that most people never have to experience, that their sacrifice mattered. Every Japanese soldier they killed, every attack they repulsed, every hour they held that position brought the war's end one step closer. And let's be clear about something. Holding that ridge wasn't glorious in the Hollywood sense. It was dirty, terrifying work. Men soiled themselves in fear. They cried for their mothers as they died. They made mistakes that got their friends killed. War strips away all the romantic notions and leaves you with the raw, ugly truth. It's about killing the other guy before he kills you, about enduring the unendurable because giving up means death. The Marines on Edson's Ridge weren't comic book heroes. They were ordinary men thrust into an extraordinary situation who somehow found the strength to prevail. When the sun rose on September 14th, and those Marines looked out over the field of carnage they'd created, they didn't celebrate. They were too exhausted, too traumatized. Many of them were in shock. Some were injured and trying not to show it. Others were mourning friends who'd died in the night. Victory didn't feel victorious. It felt like survival, like they'd cheated death by the slimmest of margins. Only later, when they'd had time to process what they'd accomplished, did the magnitude of their achievement sink in. The Japanese soldiers who attacked Edson's Ridge deserve recognition too, not for their cause, which was imperialist aggression, but for their courage. They attacked knowing the odds were brutal, knowing that charging uphill into machine gun fire was likely suicide. Their tactics were flawed, their leadership sometimes questionable, but their personal bravery was undeniable. They fought for what they believed in with the intensity that Americans struggle to comprehend. Understanding your enemy doesn't mean agreeing with them, but it does mean acknowledging their humanity and their sacrifice. In the end, the Battle of Edson's Ridge stands as one of those pivotal moments that changed the trajectory of the Pacific War. If the Japanese had broken through, if they'd retaken Henderson Field, The entire Guadalcanal campaign collapses. American offensive operations get delayed by months or years. The war drags on. How many more lives does that cost? We can't know for certain, but we can know this. 840 Marines held a ridge when they shouldn't have been able to, and that act of defiance rippled through history. So the next time someone tells you that individuals don't matter in war, that it's all about industrial capacity and logistics and grand strategy, remember Edson's Ridge. Remember 840 men who stood their ground against 2,500 because their commander believed in them and they believed in each other. Remember that sometimes, just sometimes, courage and leadership and sheer stubborn refusal to quit can overcome impossible odds. That's the lesson of Edson's Ridge. That's why we remember it 80+ years later. That's why the story still matters.